The sound of hoofbeats on manicured grass at 3 in the morning isn't something you forget. Neither is the sight of Linda Hartwell standing in her pristine front yard, screaming at my 4 horses as they trampled her award-winning rose garden into mulch. But let me tell you how we got there. Because this story doesn't start with revenge. It starts with a woman who thought she could steal the land my grandfather died protecting. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 12 years, I've owned a small horse ranch on the outskirts of Willowbrook, a quiet town that used to understand what it meant to respect your neighbors and the land they worked. That was before the Meadowview Heights, HOA, decided my property was their business. What you're about to hear isn't just another HOA horror story. This is about family legacy, about standing up to bullies who hide behind rules they write themselves, and about what happens when you push someone too far. Because Linda Hartwell learned the hard way that some people don't back down. And by the end of the story, you'll understand exactly why those horses ended up on her lawn. I inherited the ranch from my grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, in 2012. 23 acres of rolling pasture, a modest farmhouse built in 1954, and 4 horses that meant more to me than any piece of paper ever could. Thunder, storm, whisper, and blaze, each one rescued, each one family. The land had been in our family for 60 years. My grandfather bought it when Willowbrook was nothing but farms and families who understood that space meant freedom. He raised cattle first, then switched to horses when my grandmother fell in love with riding. After she passed, those horses became his whole world. I remember him sitting on the porch every evening, watching them graze in the sunset light. "Sarah," he'd say, "land like this chooses its people. We don't own it, we're just taking care of it for the next generation." When he died, I left my marketing job in the city without hesitation. The ranch wasn't just property, it was a promise I'd made to him and to myself. For the first 3 years, life was everything I'd hoped for. I woke up to the sound of horses nickering for their morning feed. I spent my days mending fences, cleaning stalls, and learning the rhythm of a life my grandfather had perfected. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was mine. The problem started in 2015, when developers broke ground on Meadowview Heights. They built it right up to my property line, hundreds of identical houses with perfect lawns and 3-car garages, each one selling for twice what my entire ranch was worth. The new residents weren't farmers or families who'd grown up understanding country life. They were urban professionals who'd moved to Willowbrook for the rustic charm but wanted all the conveniences of suburban living. And they had an HOA. Linda Hartwell moved in during the first wave of construction, into a corner lot that gave her a perfect view of my pasture. I should have known she'd be trouble the day she introduced herself. She stood at my fence line in designer jeans and spotless white sneakers, looking at my horses like they were exotic animals in a zoo. "What beautiful creatures," she said, but her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "I'm Linda, your new neighbor. I just wanted to let you know that I've been elected president of the Meadowview Heights Homeowners Association." I shook her perfectly manicured hand and made polite conversation, but something about the way she surveyed my property made my skin crawl. She asked too many questions about my property lines, about how long my family had owned the land, about whether I had any plans to modernize the ranch. "It must be so much work," she said, "maintaining all this space. Have you ever considered selling? I'm sure the right developer could make you a very generous offer." I told her politely that the ranch wasn't for sale and wouldn't be as long as I drew breath. She smiled that cold smile again and said she understood completely. But as she walked away, I caught her measuring the distance between my fence and her property line with her eyes. That conversation haunted me for weeks, though I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the way she'd said modernize, like there was something wrong with the life my grandfather had built. Maybe it was how she'd looked at my horses, not with appreciation, but with calculation. I should have trusted my instincts. Because Linda Hartwell wasn't just making conversation that day, she was conducting reconnaissance. The first official letter arrived 6 months later, and it would change everything between us forever. I inherited the ranch from my grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, in 2012. 23 acres of rolling pasture, a modest farmhouse built in 1954, and 4 horses that meant more to me than any piece of paper ever could. Thunder, storm, whisper, and blaze, each one rescued, each one family. The land had been in our family for 60 years. My grandfather bought it when Willowbrook was nothing but farms and families who understood that space meant freedom. He raised cattle first, then switched to horses when my grandmother fell in love with riding. After she passed, those horses became his whole world. I remember him sitting on the porch every evening, watching them graze in the sunset light. "Sarah," he'd say, "land like this chooses its people. We don't own it, we're just taking care of it for the next generation." When he died, I left my marketing job in the city without hesitation. The ranch wasn't just property, it was a promise I'd made to him and to myself. For the first 3 years, life was everything I'd hoped for. I woke up to the sound of horses nickering for their morning feed. I spent my days mending fences, cleaning stalls, and learning the rhythm of a life my grandfather had perfected. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was mine. The problem started in 2015, when developers broke ground on Meadowview Heights. They built it right up to my property line, hundreds of identical houses with perfect lawns and 3-car garages, each one selling for twice what my entire ranch was worth. The new residents weren't farmers or families who'd grown up understanding country life. They were urban professionals who'd moved to Willowbrook for the rustic charm, but wanted all the conveniences of suburban living. And they had an HOA. Linda Hartwell moved in during the first wave of construction into a corner lot that gave her a perfect view of my pasture. I should have known she'd be troubled the day she introduced herself. She stood at my fence line in designer jeans and spotless white sneakers, looking at my horses like they were exotic animals in a zoo. "What beautiful creatures," she said, but her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "I'm Linda, your new neighbor. I just wanted to let you know that I've been elected president of the Meadowview Heights Homeowners Association." I shook her perfectly manicured hand and made polite conversation, but something about the way she surveyed my property made my skin crawl. She asked too many questions about my property lines, about how long my family had owned the land, about whether I had any plans to modernize the ranch. "It must be so much work," she said, "maintaining all this space. Have you ever considered selling? I'm sure the right developer could make you a very generous offer." I told her politely that the ranch wasn't for sale and wouldn't be as long as I drew breath. She smiled that cold smile again and said she understood completely. But as she walked away, I caught her measuring the distance between my fence and her property line with her eyes. That conversation haunted me for weeks, though I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the way she'd said modernize, like there was something wrong with the life my grandfather had built. Maybe it was how she'd looked at my horses, not with appreciation, but with calculation. I should have trusted my instincts. Because Linda Hartwell wasn't just making conversation that day, she was conducting reconnaissance. The first official letter arrived 6 months later, and it would change everything between us forever. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. My neighbor Jim Carver, an elderly man who lived in a small house that predated Meadowview Heights by 20 years. Jim had been keeping to himself since the subdivision went up, but one evening, in late October, he knocked on my door with a manila envelope under his arm. "Sarah," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "there's something you need to see." We sat at my kitchen table as Jim spread out photocopied documents, emails, meeting minutes, legal correspondence. His hands shook as he pointed to the papers. "My grandson works for the county planning department," he explained. "He's not supposed to share this stuff, but he knows what Linda's been doing to you, and he thinks it's wrong." What I read in those documents changed everything I thought I knew about Linda Hartwell's crusade against my ranch. The first email was from Linda to a commercial development company called Sunrise Properties, dated just 2 weeks after she'd introduced herself to me. In it, she outlined a strategic acquisition opportunity for my 23 acres, describing it as prime development land currently underutilized for agricultural purposes. But it was the second email that made my blood run cold. Linda had been in direct contact with the county zoning department, inquiring about the process for rezoning agricultural land for residential development. She'd specifically asked about procedures for addressing non-compliant livestock operations that might impede rezoning applications. The pattern became clear as I read through month after month of correspondence. Linda hadn't been trying to protect her neighborhood from my horses. She'd been building a legal case to have my property condemned or rezoned so Sunrise Properties could acquire it for a fraction of its development value. Every complaint she'd filed, every petition she'd circulated, every photograph she'd taken it, was all part of a calculated plan to devalue my property and force me to sell. "There's more," Jim said quietly, pulling out another set of documents. "Look at this." It was a purchase agreement between Linda Hartwell and Sunrise Properties, dated 6 months in the future. According to the contract, Linda would receive a finder's fee of $200,000 if she successfully facilitated the acquisition of my property. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Linda hadn't been acting as a concerned neighbor or even an overzealous HOA president. She'd been running a con, using her position and the resources of her HOA to orchestrate the theft of my family's land. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked Jim. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his weathered hands. "My family used to farm here too," he said finally. 3 generations of carvers worked this land before the developers came. I sold out when my wife got sick, needed the money for her medical bills. But watching what Linda's doing to you, it's like watching them steal the soul of this place all over again." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the pasture, where thunder, storm, whisper, and blaze were grazing in the moonlight. They lifted their heads when they saw me, and Thunder trotted over to nuzzle my shoulder. "I'm sorry, boy," I whispered, stroking his neck. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what she was really doing." But understanding Linda's plan was only half the battle. Now I needed to stop her. I called David Chen first thing the next morning and explained what Jim had discovered. David's usually calm demeanor cracked when I read him the details of Linda's scheme. "This is fraud," he said. "Conspiracy, possibly extortion. We need to contact the county attorney's office immediately." But even as we planned our legal response, I knew it would take months or even years to work through the system. Linda's complaints and harassment campaigns would continue, and there was no guarantee the county would take action against her. I needed something more immediate, something that would expose Linda's true motives to the community she'd turned against me. That's when I remembered the Meadowview Heights annual community meeting, scheduled for the 3rd Saturday in November. It was Linda's biggest stage, the event where she presented her annual community improvement initiatives to the entire subdivision. According to the HOA, bylaws Jim had helped me locate, any property owner affected by HOA actions had the right to address the community during the public comment period. Linda had spent months building a narrative about my dangerous horses and irresponsible ranch management. It was time to tell the real story. But first, I needed to gather more evidence. And I needed to do something that would get Linda's attention in a way she'd never forget. The plan that formed in my mind was risky, potentially illegal, and definitely the kind of thing my grandfather would have called fighting fire with fire. But after months of harassment, false accusations, and attempted theft of my family's legacy, I was done being the victim in Linda Hartwell's story. The Meadowview Heights Community Center was packed the night of November 16th. I arrived early, sitting in the back row with a folder full of documents and a knot of nervous energy in my stomach. Linda hadn't seen me come in. She was busy at the front of the room, arranging her presentation materials with the meticulous precision of someone who'd orchestrated this evening down to the smallest detail. For 45 minutes, I listened to her perform. She presented charts showing declining property values due to agricultural nuisances. She displayed photos of my ranch taken from her property line, carefully cropped to make my well-maintained facilities look neglected and dangerous. She shared testimonials from residents who'd signed her petition, people who described their fear of my horses with the kind of rehearsed emotion you might expect in a courtroom drama. In conclusion, Linda said, clicking to her final slide, the Meadowview Heights HOA formally requests that the county take immediate action to address this ongoing threat to our community. We cannot allow one person's stubborn refusal to modernize to compromise the safety and property values of hundreds of families. The applause was polite but enthusiastic. Linda had done her job well. She'd convinced these people that I was their enemy. When the moderator called for public comments, I stood up. "I'd like to address the community," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. Linda's face went pale when she saw me. "I'm sorry, but public comment is limited to HOA members," she said quickly. I pulled out David Chen's letter and held it up. "According to your own bylaws, any property owner affected by HOA actions has the right to speak." My lawyer confirmed it this afternoon. The moderator, a nervous-looking man named Robert, glanced at Linda uncertainly. "Well, I suppose, if it's in the bylaws." I walked to the front of the room, aware that every eye was on me. These were my neighbors, people I'd waved to at the grocery store, families I'd seen walking their dogs past my property line. For months, they'd known me only through Linda's version of who I was. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," I began. "I own the horse ranch adjacent to your subdivision. For the past 8 months, I've been accused of running an unsafe operation, of threatening your families, of being a bad neighbor who refuses to follow reasonable rules." I paused, looking out at the crowd. Some faces were hostile, others curious. A few looked uncomfortable, as if they were beginning to sense that something wasn't quite right about this situation. Tonight, I want to tell you the truth about why Linda Hartwell has been so determined to get rid of my horses. Linda stood up abruptly. "This is inappropriate. Mrs. Mitchell is here to cause trouble, not to contribute constructively to our community discussion." "Let her speak," someone called from the middle of the room. I was surprised to see it was Jim Carver, who'd slipped in during Linda's presentation. "If she's got something to say, we ought to hear it." I opened my folder and pulled out the first document, Linda's email to Sunrise Properties. 8 months ago, Linda Hartwell contacted a commercial development company about acquiring my property. She described my ranch as underutilized agricultural lands and discussed strategies for forcing me to sell. A murmur went through the room. Linda's face had gone from pale to bright red. That's a private communication taken out of context," she stammered. I held up the next document. "This is Linda's correspondence with the county's zoning department, asking about procedures for having livestock operations declared non-compliant, so the land could be rezoned for development." The murmur grew louder. I could see people looking at Linda with new eyes, beginning to understand that they'd been manipulated. "And this," I said, holding up the purchase agreement, "is a contract between Linda Hartwell and Sunrise Properties. If she successfully forces me to sell my property, she'll receive a finder's fee of $200,000. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some demanding to see the documents, others confronting Linda directly. Through the chaos, I heard Linda's voice rising desperately. Those documents were obtained illegally. She has no right to it. The documents are public record. David Chen's voice cut through the noise. I hadn't seen him come in, but there he was, standing near the door with his briefcase in hand. I filed a formal complaint with the county attorney's office this afternoon. Mrs. Hartwell is under investigation for fraud and conspiracy. That silenced the room completely. Linda stood frozen at the front, her carefully constructed presentation forgotten, her community turning to stare at her with confusion and betrayal. But I wasn't finished yet. "I want you all to understand something," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "For months, you've been told that my horses are dangerous, that my ranch is a threat to your families. But not one of you has ever visited my property. Not one of you has seen how I care for my animals or talked to me about your concerns." I looked directly at Linda. "You've been lied to. Used. Linda Hartwell doesn't care about your property values or your children's safety. She cares about $200,000, and she was willing to destroy my family's legacy to get it." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. People were demanding Linda's resignation. Others were asking to see my ranch for themselves. A few were apologizing for signing the petition. Through it all, Linda sat in her chair at the front of the room, her face buried in her hands. But as satisfying as it was to expose her scheme, I knew this was just the beginning. Linda Hartwell had spent months making my life miserable, and while the truth was finally out, she hadn't faced any real consequences for what she'd tried to do to me. That would change in exactly 48 hours when I implemented the final phase of my plan. Because sometimes, justice isn't just about legal victories and public vindication. Sometimes, it's about making sure someone truly understands the cost of their actions. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. What I did wasn't planned as revenge. It started as an accident that became an opportunity for Linda to experience firsthand what it felt like to have someone else's actions disrupt her perfect world. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the community meeting. I was in the barn, checking on Thunder, who'd been favoring his left front hoof, when I heard the distinctive sound of wood splintering. A section of fence along the property line had finally given way, not the sturdy oak posts my grandfather had set, but a newer section I'd repaired with cheaper materials during a particularly tight month. 4 horses, who'd spent their lives respecting boundaries, suddenly found themselves free to explore. I should have noticed immediately, should have been watching more carefully. But I was focused on Thunder's hoof, worried that he might have picked up a stone or developed an abscess. By the time I realized what had happened, Thunder, Storm, Whisper, and Blaze had been loose for almost an hour. My first instinct was panic. Horses on suburban streets, potential traffic accidents, liability issues, every horse owner's nightmare was playing out in real time. I grabbed their lead ropes and ran toward the broken fence, calling their names, praying they hadn't wandered far. But they hadn't headed for the road. They'd found something much more interesting. Linda Hartwell's pristine lawn stretched out like a green carpet behind her house, bordered by the rose garden she'd spent thousands of dollars perfecting. It was early November, but the grass was still emerald green thanks to her elaborate sprinkler system and weekly lawn service. And in the middle of it all were my 4 horses, grazing contentedly like they'd discovered paradise. I stood at the fence line, torn between horror and something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. The horses weren't destroying Linda's lawn out of malice. They were simply doing what horses do when they find good grass. But the effect was devastating to a yard that had been maintained with obsessive precision. Thunder looked up when he saw me, grass hanging from his mouth, his expression almost apologetic. Whisper had found Linda's prized rose bushes and was methodically working her way through what had probably been a $1,000 landscaping investment. I knew I had to get them back immediately. But As I climbed through the broken fence, I heard Linda's voice from inside her house. She was on the phone, probably with another HOA member, and I caught fragments of her conversation through her open kitchen window. "County attorney is just trying to embarrass me. Those documents don't prove anything. I'll find another way to get rid of that ranch." That's when my sense of urgency faded. Linda Hartwell was still plotting against me, still looking for ways to destroy everything my grandfather had built. She'd been exposed and humiliated, but she hadn't learned anything from the experience. Maybe it was time for a more direct lesson. I walked slowly across her lawn, taking my time to approach each horse. Storm lifted his head when I reached him, and I scratched his neck affectionately. "Easy, boy," I whispered. "Take your time." For 20 minutes, I moved among my horses with deliberate care. I checked Thunder's hoof. It was fine, just a small stone that I removed easily. I brushed grass stains off Whisper's coat. I made sure Blaze hadn't gotten tangled in Linda's garden hose. All the while, 4 horses continued their methodical destruction of Linda Hartwell's perfect yard. The hoof prints alone would take months to repair. The rose garden would need to be completely replanted. The sprinkler heads that Storm had stepped on would require professional replacement. But the real damage was to Linda's image of control, her ability to maintain the kind of flawless suburban perfection that defined her identity. I was leading Thunder back toward the fence when Linda's back door exploded open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she screamed, running across her lawn in house slippers and a bathrobe. "Get those animals off my property right now." "I'm retrieving my horses," I said calmly, not stopping my slow walk toward the fence. There was a problem with my fencing. "I'm fixing it as quickly as I can." "Quickly?" Linda's voice cracked with rage. "They've destroyed everything. Look at my roses. Look at my lawn." I stopped and turned to face her. "I'm sorry about the damage, Linda. Sometimes animals do unpredictable things. Sometimes they cause problems for their neighbors through no fault of their owners." The irony wasn't lost on her. I could see the recognition in her eyes, the understanding that she was experiencing exactly what she'd tried to inflict on me through months of harassment and false accusations. "I'm calling the police," she said, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. "That's your right," I replied, continuing my leisurely progress toward the fence with Thunder in tow. "I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about your ongoing harassment campaign against my ranch, especially since the county attorney is already investigating your fraud scheme." Linda's face went through several different colors as she stood there, helpless to do anything but watch as I calmly rounded up each horse. By the time I led Blaze back through the broken fence, Linda's perfect lawn looked like a construction site. The police did come, of course. Officer Martinez, the same deputy who'd responded to my trespassing complaint against Linda, took a report and asked me about the property damage. I explained about the broken fence, showed him the repair work I'd already started, and provided documentation of my property boundaries. "Accidents happen," he said, closing his notepad, "especially when people are dealing with large animals. I'm sure your insurance will sort out any damages." Linda tried to argue that I'd let the horses loose intentionally, that it was some kind of revenge plot. But she had no proof, and Officer Martinez seemed more interested in discussing the county attorney's investigation into her HOA activities than pursuing charges against me. The insurance claim took 6 weeks to process. Linda's repairs cost just over $8,000, a fraction of what she'd spent on legal fees trying to steal my property, but enough to remind her every day for months that her actions had consequences. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was watching Linda Hartwell's reputation in Meadowview Heights crumble as the truth about her scheme spread through the community. 3 families had already filed complaints against her with the HOA board. 2 others had started a petition demanding her removal as president. The development deal with Sunrise Properties fell through when the county attorney's investigation became public. The company didn't want to be associated with someone under investigation for fraud, and they certainly didn't want the bad publicity of trying to force out a family ranch. Linda put her house on the market 2 months later. I heard from Jim Carver that she'd taken a job in Phoenix and wanted to start fresh somewhere else. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday, she was gone. I never saw her again after that morning on her ruined lawn, never had a chance to tell her what I really thought about someone who would try to destroy a family legacy for money. But maybe the lesson was more effective this way. Sometimes the best justice is simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. The Meadowview Heights HOA elected a new president, a retired teacher named Margaret Ross, who actually knocked on my door to introduce herself properly. We had coffee on my porch, and she met all 4 horses. She even brought her granddaughter by the following week to learn about ranch life. We were all so embarrassed when we learned the truth about Linda, Margaret told me. Most of us moved here because we wanted to be part of a community, not because we wanted to drive out the people who were already here. These days, I get visitors from the subdivision regularly. Kids who want to pet the horses, families who are curious about ranch life, neighbors who stop by just to chat. My property isn't isolated anymore. It's part of a community that actually understands what community means. Thunder, Storm, Whisper, and Blaze are local celebrities now. The fence has been repaired with proper oak posts that will last another 60 years. And when I sit on my porch in the evenings, watching them graze in the sunset light, I can almost hear my grandfather's voice telling me that the land chose its people after all. Some of you might think what I did to Linda's lawn was petty or cruel. You might believe I should have rounded up those horses immediately, fixed the damage, and taken the high road. And maybe you're right. Maybe that would have been the more mature response. But I learned something important that morning. Sometimes people need to experience the consequences of their actions in a way that no court judgment or public exposure can provide. Sometimes the only way a bully learns to stop is when they understand what it feels like to be powerless. Linda Hartwell spent months trying to destroy my family's legacy for her own financial gain. She lied to my neighbors, harassed me with false accusations, and used her position of authority to try to steal land that had been in my family for generations. In the end, she lost everything she'd tried so hard to protect: her perfect lawn, her reputation, her position of power, and her place in the community she'd tried to manipulate. And my horses? They're still here, grazing peacefully on land that will stay in my family for generations to come. Because some promises are worth keeping, no matter what it costs to honor them. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or a neighbor who thought they could push you around, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of justice, served with a side of horse hooves, subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing up to bullies, protecting what matters most, and the sometimes sweet taste of well-deserved revenge. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the best way to deal with people who won't respect your boundaries is to show them what happens when boundaries disappear entirely.